Hello, I'm Bella and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Music. My PhD research focuses on women violinists in England in the first half of the long 19th century. Although today we might think of the violin as being played pretty much equally by both male and female musicians, this is a relatively recent development in the instrument's history, because until the late 1870s it was played almost exclusively by men. There's not a huge amount of existing scholarship around the topic, and that which exists mainly focuses on women after 1870. My research argues that the handful of women who performed on the violin in England before this point were far more important than the existing literature suggests, not only because they paved the way for the violin to become acceptable as an instrument for women, but also because tracing their careers and analysing the reviews of their performances reveals an awful lot about the nature of objections to women playing the violin. This research has involved quite a lot of digging through archives and analysing contemporary sources, things like concert programmes, reviews, diaries and articles in musical and ladies' journals, to try and build a really accurate picture of what these women's lives and careers looked like and what the public and critical responses were to their performances. So, what were the objections to women playing the violin? Well, 19th century sources are often unhelpfully vague. It's rare to find explicit references to women being forbidden from playing the violin, but books on etiquette and female education typically only listed the instruments for women as being singing, the harp, piano, and occasionally the guitar. However, the musical press quite often referred to a prejudice against female violinists. The Quarterly Musical Magazine exclaimed in 1888 that we cannot help regarding the exclusion of females from the violin as a prejudice and nothing but a prejudice. This was echoed over 50 years later by the musical world. There is a strong and scarcely unnatural prejudice against a female fiddler. The length of time between these remarks gives some indication of the pervasive nature of the objections. Recent academic works refer to this in terms of an informal ban, although I'd probably argue that the violin being socially prohibited for women is a more nuanced way of approaching this. The existing literature suggests a range of factors which contributed to this social prohibition, but many of these are dependent on modern readings of unspoken and internalised socio-cultural notions. Firstly, there's the potential homoerotic connotations of women playing an instrument ascribed as female, thanks to both its shape and pitch. Meiko Kawabata's work describes women violinists as battling against the perceived impropriety of publicly handling a symbolic feminine body, as well as a phallic object. Paula Gillett's work has also suggested the violin's links to the occult as a factor, although it is not directly backed up by any 19th century sources. However, the association would have been quite present in the 19th century imagination, thanks to Tartini and Paganini, who both traded on the trope of the violin as the devil's instrument. I think it's quite plausible that these links rendered the violin unsuitable for young ladies, whom society held to be innately moral creatures. My own work also argues that the strong associations of the violin with virtuoso performance made it incompatible with the socially appropriate modes of female music making. Women's musical roles reflected their societal position, to accompany rather than act in a leading role, and they therefore remained seated at cumbersome instruments like the piano and the harp, which confine them to the domestic realm of the home. Finally, we come to aesthetic objections to women playing the violin, and I thought it would be interesting to unpick this in a bit of detail in today's talk. The current work on women violinists suggests two main aesthetic aspects at play in the prohibition. The first is the quick movements of the bow arm needed in faster passages. And the second is the potential for distortion of the face through holding the violin in place. So I think they're talking about sort of a nice double chin effect that you get here. I'd also suggest that the bruising the violin leaves on the neck might also have been a factor, and I've recently had this anecdotally confirmed. Now here we can see Nicola Benedetti, who's a really well-known violinist with her very impressive practice mark there. So we'll start off with one of the earliest objections that I found to women players. It relates to the French violinist Louise Gathereau, who performed in England between 1789 and the mid-1790s. Although Gathereau generally fared quite well in the short press reviews, accounts by the public reveal a less positive reaction, including the oboist and diarist W.T. Park's scathing remark that the ear was more gratified than the eye by this lady's masculine effort. It was Gathereau's performances that also incited Park to make his now infamous statement that any lady playing on a valuable Cremona fiddle if she is desirous of enrapturing her audience, should display her talent in a situation where there is only just light enough to make darkness visible. Although the objection discussed is clearly aesthetic, it's also rather ambiguous in that it doesn't actually give us that much information about what the problem was. The nature of the aesthetic objections to women violinists became clearer with the performances of the teenage Italian Nonno Sisters in England during the late 1830s to 40s. However, Teresa, the elder sister's age, was consistently given as 2 years younger than she actually was. Perhaps a strategy to avoid the issues of being a woman violinist, or, more probably, to capitalise on the marketability of sibling prodigies. Note the white dresses and the childish rather than adult hairstyles. Many of the reviews of the Nonno sisters emphasised their feminine attributes, their modest manner and their ladylike deportment were recurring themes, which placed the sisters' performance within the bounds of acceptable female behaviour. A couple of specific reviews of the sisters from 1845 are particularly helpful in illustrating the conflicting critical responses. John Bull remarked, "They have conquered the prejudice against female violinists, for they enchant everybody by the grace as well as the modest simplicity of their deportment." Meanwhile, the Standard lamented the regret that the greater portion of their short lives should have been absorbed in an unsuitable pursuit, one so destructive to the graces of womanly deportment. So we can see that deportment and grace, or lack of it, seem to be the crux of the issue. But there's a conflict illustrated here between those who held to the prejudice and those who saw it as being overcome. The Nonnos were famous across Europe, and although Maria died at the age of 15, Teresa in particular was held up as a benchmark for female players for much of the century. Finally, I'd like to discuss the Moravian violinist Wilma Norman, who was the first woman violinist to achieve a sustained performing career. Neruda was clearly exceptional. She started her career touring as a child prodigy with her musical family, and when she performed in England as an adult from 1869 onwards, she was immediately embraced by both the musical elite and the aristocracy, including the royal family. Reviews of her playing were almost unanimously positive, and notably took her more seriously than earlier players. It appears to me that the standard of her playing was at such a high level it enabled her to transcend many of the usual objections to female players. The musical world remarked of one of her initial performances in England that her use of the bow arm is so easy and graceful that we're compelled to waive the not quite unnatural objection to see such an instrument as the fiddle in the delicate hands of a lady. As her career grew more established, Neruda's reviews frequently described her in a way which allowed her success in the masculine realm of violin playing, while still conforming to feminine ideals. A later example from 1880 highlights the broader impact of this. Uniting with the firmness and vigour of her man's playing, the purity of style and intonation of a great artist, as well as her own perfect grace and delicate manipulation, has proved to the public at large what a woman can do in this field, at least. Her feminine ease and elegance add an unusual charm to violin playing. Interestingly, though, we see a transition in aesthetics with Neruda. Where Galdero was recommended to play in the dark, and the Nonnos were praised for their grace, retrospectives from the end of the century document a distinct shift in aesthetic dialogue around the violin at the time of Neruda's performances in the 1870s, making the instrument not only acceptable but even a little bit sexy for a woman to play, with numerous and slightly uncomfortable mentions of her arms in reviews. One contemporary review from 1869 observed that the bare white arms of the gifted lady were as full of power as of grace, while an 1892 retrospective remarked, especially when in an evening dress, her beautifully shaped arms and hands are seen to the utmost advantage. She has done more than anyone else to establish an honourable position for female violinists, for, until her advent, that instrument was too much regarded as exclusively masculine. This was echoed in 1893 by George Bernard Shaw, who attributed the rise in proficient female violinists since the 1870s as being chiefly because Madame Neruda proved at that time that the violin shows off a good figure. We can therefore see a clear, if evolving, aesthetic objection to women playing the violin in the first half of the long 19th century, as evidenced by contemporary critical responses and writings. I think it's important to recognise the importance of the prejudice against women violinists in the instrument's history. Women still face barriers in various strengths and forms in present-day musical cultures, from the brass band tradition to rock and electronic music to the politics surrounding female conductors. My research hopefully contributes to building an understanding of this as being part of a long history of female exclusion and helps us understand the ways in which this can be overcome. Thank you for watching.